From the family oven to the first workshop, we are in the year 1919, in the south of Germany, a country that is still bleeding from the wounds of war. The factories are half empty, the soldiers return with a lost gaze, and the towns find ways to move forward with the little they have. In one of those towns, Herzogenaurach, the streets are narrow, the houses are low, and the smell of burned coal mixes with that of freshly baked bread. In one of those houses lives the Dassler family, and in the middle of that gray routine is Adolf, whom everyone is starting to call Adi, a quiet young man who has returned from the front with less innocence, but with an idea that clings to his mind with the same force with which others cling to a bottle or a deck of cards. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining. This evening, I would love to read you in the comments, but do not get tangled up with the call to action. We return to Herzogenaurach. The economy recovers slowly. The trains bring stories of misery. The fields continue to offer work, and sports become for many a valve of escape, a space where for a few minutes one can run, sweat, and compete without thinking about what has been lost. Adi observes that world with attention, not from the stands, but almost always from the sidelines, attentive to the details that others overlook. On the ground floor of the family house, his mother uses an oven to bake bread and sell it to the neighbors. It is a warm environment, full of flour in the air and brief conversation, but little by little that same space begins to change in smell and sound. Among sacks and trays appear leather strips, loose nails, worn soles that Adi collects, disassembles, and studies as if they were a puzzle. Where before one only heard the crackle of bread, now a sewing machine buzzes, tools collide, and boots cut open in half accumulate, because he wants to understand why they hurt, why they weigh so much, why they seem made for anything except running. All his obsession is born from a very simple image: destroyed feet. During the war, he has seen comrades march kilometers with footwear that soaks up water, that splits at the seams, that does not respect the shape of the foot. Back in the town, he sees runners and improvised football players struggling against rigid boots, designed to last years, but not to offer speed or comfort. While others accept that this is the available footwear and that there is no other option, Adi remains trapped in that discomfort of others, convinced that there is a technical problem that could be solved with patience and a different way of thinking about the shoe. The workshop is born almost unintentionally, as a natural extension of that restlessness. The kitchen table becomes a workbench. In one corner, a small pile of nails shines next to some wooden lasts he has obtained secondhand. The walls fill with templates cut by hand and sketches that blend measurements, notes, and comments he hears on the playing field. Adi gets up early, helps at home, and as soon as he can, he locks himself away with his materials. He experiments with different thicknesses of leather, cuts pieces to reduce weight, changes the position of the reinforcements, and sews again and again until he achieves a pair of shoes that, at least on the table, seem lighter and more rational than the usual ones. In that same environment enters and exits Rudolf, his older brother, with a completely different character, where Adi is introspective and meticulous, Rudy is dynamic, sociable, someone who enjoys talking with the people of the town, who knows merchants, coaches, owners of modest teams. He is the one who begins to understand that the oddities of his younger brother can turn into something greater than a hobby. He sees how those first pairs, clumsy and still rough, awaken curiosity among the boys who train in the nearby meadows, and realizes that there is an opportunity if they manage to organize the chaos of the kitchen and give shape to a small factory. The first clients are almost always acquaintances: a neighbor who runs faster than the others, an apprentice football player, a coach who agrees to try Adi's light boots on one of his players. There are no stamped brands or grand promises, only the sensation, when putting them on, that the shoe adapts a little better to the foot, that it holds more firmly when turning, that it weighs less when the field turns to mud. Adi listens carefully to each comment, takes mental note of where it tightens, where it loosens, where it slips, and returns to the workbench like an artisan who has declared war against the mediocre standard. The relationship between the two brothers then begins to take shape as a kind of natural partnership. Adi does not want to distract himself with conversations or negotiations. He prefers to stay surrounded by leather and tools. Rudolf is in charge of visiting clubs, presenting the models, negotiating small orders, and collecting the first invoices. They still do not have a name that resonates beyond the town, but they are already building something essential, a reputation. Word of mouth does the rest, and each time an athlete improves performance with those different boots, the idea that something special is happening in the Dassler house strengthens a little more. In 1924, when the demand already exceeds what can be managed in a crowded kitchen, the family takes the logical step to formalize the business. Thus is born Gebrüder Dassler Schuhfabrik, the shoe factory of the Dassler brothers, which settles into a modest building, but one more appropriate for the scale they are reaching. The machines stop being squeezed between the cupboard and the dining table and are aligned in a dedicated space. The employees begin to have a certain order of tasks, and the orders start to be recorded with more discipline, although the essence remains the same. The smell of leather, the constant tapping of the lasts, and living attentive to the next pair that must be improved. The philosophy of the workshop is consolidated almost without needing to be written anywhere. Each sport requires a different shoe. Each position on the field has specific needs, and Adi's work consists of translating those needs into design decisions. If a runner needs traction on a wet track, the pattern of the nails is adjusted. If a football player complains that he cannot feel the ball, the thickness of the leather is modified. If a javelin thrower describes a certain imbalance, the stability of the heel is adjusted. That constant listening, applied to a product that is revised again and again, turns the factory into a kind of high-performance laboratory long before that expression becomes popular. From the outside, the town continues to see the Dassler family as hardworking people who have known how to reinvent themselves in difficult times, but the regional athletics tracks have already noticed the difference. There, in those small competitions, athletes begin to appear with a different shine on their feet, a shine that does not come from luxury, but from intensive use, from mud, from wear. Each victory achieved with a pair of those handmade boots is a reminder that something is silently changing, and each coach who approaches Rudolf to place a new order pushes the company a little further towards a larger stage. In that mixture of physical effort, technical intuition, and commercial instinct is the seed of what, with time, will become a global brand. For now, it is still a story of a small town, of family, and of modest machines, but the direction is already marked. Those shoes born in the warmth of a family oven will soon have to face the most demanding stage of sports. And it will be there, under pressure and the spotlight, where Adi's obsessive work begins to change everything. The Olympic leap and Jesse Owens. In the middle of the decade of 1930, the world lived in an uneasy calm, a kind of tense pause in which countries attempted to recover from the Great Depression while, in Europe, a Germany governed by the Nazi regime became obsessed with displaying power, order, and grandeur in every possible arena, including sports. For the Dassler family, who continued in Herzogenaurach sewing shoes at an increasingly intense pace, that political reality was perceived as a background noise that invaded everything, but at the same time, within, in their small universe, a door opened that connected their workshop directly to the largest showcase that could exist for a manufacturer of athletic footwear. The Olympic Games of Berlin of 1936. Adi had spent years refining his models, adjusting spikes, controlling weights and heights, and had learned that important competitions were not only a sporting test, but also an opportunity to observe how his shoes behaved under extreme conditions, with the public on edge and athletes pushed to the limit of their abilities. When he heard that the best athletes on the turn, the planet would gather in Berlin, he understood that, for the first time, his work could leave the regional scale and measure itself against the best in the world. This was not a marketing plan calculated with agencies and market studies, but rather the intuition of a craftsman who knew that his innovation needed a grand stage to prove what it was capable of. With the quiet determination that characterized him, he prepared a suitcase filled with prototypes, spiked shoes designed specifically for sprinters, models adapted for jumpers, variants created for long-distance events. Each pair, containing small details he had incorporated thanks to the feedback of athletes who trained on cinder tracks and improvised fields. That suitcase did not yet contain a recognizable brand for the general public. It carried no sophisticated logos nor campaigns behind it, but it was the fruit of years, of listening, observing, and adjusting, concentrated in a few kilograms of leather, fabric, and metal. When Adi arrived at the Olympic Village, he encountered an environment very different from that of his town. Delegations from every continent, languages mixed in the corridors, protective coaches, guarding their athletes, and regime officials controlling every detail of the event. The organization had been designed to show the world an impeccable image of the new Germany, and in the midst of that setting emerged figures who, without knowing it, would become an essential part of the history of the company from Herzogenaurach. Adi did not have special credentials. He moved with modesty, knocked on doors, introduced himself to coaches, and offered his suitcase like someone offering a tool created specifically to squeeze a tenth of a second from the track. At first, the reception was cold, because many coaches were distrustful of an unknown man who came from a small workshop and claimed to have shoes superior to those their athletes already used. But Adi's respectful insistence, his way of explaining concrete details about grip, lightness, or the structure of the footwear, eventually opened gaps. Some coaches agreed to test a pair during training sessions, perhaps because they sensed that someone who spoke in that way truly understood the trade, or perhaps because in high-level sports any advantage, no matter how small it might seem, could mark the difference between a medal and anonymity. In this context emerged the figure of Jesse Owens, a young African-American sprinter who represented exactly the opposite of what the Nazi regime wanted to celebrate: talent, strength, and a personal story that shattered the racist narrative that Berlin attempted to impose on the world. Owens arrived at the Games carrying the symbolic weight of his country, with the pressure of competing in a stadium filled with flags bearing swastikas and authorities who did not look kindly on the possibility of a black athlete becoming the protagonist, while all he wanted was to do what he did best: run faster than anyone, jump farther than any rival, and prove on the track what he was worth. The connection between Owens and Adi's shoes is one of those scenes that seem small in the moment but that, over time, become turning points. One way or another, through coaches, contacts, or recommendations within the delegation itself, the runner ended up trying one of the spiked models developed in Herzogenaurach. What mattered here was not the exact detail of the negotiation but the result. Jesse felt that the shoes adapted to his style, that they allowed him to dig his feet more firmly into the starting blocks, that they offered him confidence in acceleration, and above all, that they did not become an additional obstacle he had to manage mentally during the race. The days of competition began. The Berlin stadium filled to the last seat, the loudspeakers roared, the cameras of the era captured every start, and the streets of the world followed with attention what occurred on those tracks. Owens launched himself into the 100-meter race, then the 200-meter race, then the long jump, and the relay, and in all of them, his performance was extraordinary. 4 gold medals before the uncomfortable gaze of a regime that had prepared the Games to showcase supposed racial superiority. In the surviving images of those races, if one looks closely at the champion's feet, one can distinguish the spikes of the shoes that emerged from a small workshop in Bavaria. It is difficult to measure how much of Owens's success corresponded to his talent and how much to the tools he used, because in elite sports every detail accumulates and intertwines with the rest. But for the entrepreneurial history of the Dassler family, this moment has an incalculable force. A young entrepreneur who had started by cutting leather on his kitchen table had succeeded in getting one of the most important athletes of his time to use his product on the most influential sporting stage in the world. Without advertisements, without formal sponsorship, without giant posters, what had happened was a type of validation even more powerful than an advertising campaign: the tacit approval of performance. The news that Jesse Owens had competed wearing their shoes traveled quickly through sporting circles, was discussed among coaches, mentioned in clubs, and became a reference point for anyone seeking high-level equipment. The brand was not yet called Adidas. There were no recognizable 3 stripes, but already a powerful mental association existed between the shoes of the Dassler family and the image of the sprinter flying across the Berlin track. For an entrepreneur, this type of milestone is much more than a simple anecdote. It becomes a tool for negotiation, a solid argument in front of new clients, a reason to continue taking risks and improving. In the factory of Herzogenaurach, meanwhile, the machines never stopped. Each letter that arrived, each comment from the games, each performance figure became working material. Adi reaffirmed his conviction that the key was to specialize footwear according to the discipline, to listen to the athlete before imposing a design, to treat each pair of shoes as a technical piece. That must contribute something concrete to the result. The neighbors began to perceive that this local company had made a leap difficult to imagine a few years earlier, and within the factory there was a sense of pride and responsibility regarding what might come next. However, while the sporting feats filled headlines and individual triumphs were celebrated with enthusiasm, the political and social reality of Germany hardened. The same regime that had used the Olympic Games as a showcase of modernity and strength began to accelerate decisions that would affect the entire population. And no company, whether small or medium-sized, would be able to remain on the sidelines of that course. Adi continued focused on his shoes, on his athletes, and on his technical ideas, but the context surrounding his workshop was changing at great speed, and that change would soon pull his story toward a much more complex and darker stage. Nazis, war, and the uncomfortable shadow. When the Olympic flame in Berlin goes out and the athletes return to their countries with medals and memories, Germany enters a phase in which the athletic enthusiasm begins to merge with increasingly visible political hardening. The flags with the swastika are no longer just decorative elements at major events, but part of the everyday landscape, and the decisions of the regime begin to penetrate every corner of society, including factories, shops, and small workshops that, until then, had been focused on their own day-to-day operations. The company of the Dassler brothers, strengthened by the prestige gained thanks to the achievements of Jesse Owens and other athletes, is no longer a local curiosity, but it is not a giant capable of challenging the surrounding context either. It is part of the network of businesses that find themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. If you want to survive, you are going to have to interact with power. The National Socialist Party, which at first could seem like just another political actor, has consolidated itself as a total government, and belonging to its structure is becoming an unspoken requirement to gain access to certain advantages, contracts, or simply to avoid trouble. Adi and Rudolf, far from being major ideologues, move in that gray zone that surrounds many entrepreneurs of the period. Their priority is to keep the factory alive, ensure the jobs of their employees, and continue developing sports footwear. Within that logic, they accept joining the party, signing forms, attending meetings, and being seen at events where the official ideology permeates everything. They are not the only ones. Thousands of medium-sized business owners do the same, some out of conviction, others out of fear, and others out of a pragmatic combination of both. But the fact remains, and it becomes part of the shadow that will accompany the brand for decades. As the regime advances in its plans, the idea grows stronger that industry must place itself at the service of the nation and its project of expansion. Sport, which had been used as a display of strength at the Olympic Games, gives way to the military machinery. The factory in Herzogenaurach, with its experience in technical footwear, becomes an interesting asset for the war effort. Soldiers who march for kilometers need resistant boots. Troops deployed on different fronts require effective equipment, and the state begins to direct the production of many companies towards the needs of the Wehrmacht. What had once been orders for shoes for runners or football players begins to alternate with orders related to the army, and the sporting identity of the company is gradually pushed towards a role it had never sought. The war years bring with them changes that affect both the outside and the inside of the factory. Young men are called to the front, labor becomes scarce, raw materials are rationed, and the state intervenes in economic planning with growing aggressiveness. In that context, the line that separates entrepreneurship from complicity becomes blurred and painful. The Dasslers company, like many others, ends up forming part of a system that uses forced laborers brought from occupied territories and prisoner camps. People who did not choose to be there, housed in harsh conditions, sewing, cutting, and riveting in the name of a war industry that has turned production into yet another cog in an inhumane machine. For anyone who analyses history with perspective, this period is especially uncomfortable because it breaks the clean, almost heroic image of the entrepreneur who only fights against scarcity or competition. Here, the business develops under the shadow of a criminal regime, and although each biography shades the decisions differently, the fundamental fact remains. The company benefited from military orders and from an environment in which human rights were trampled daily. The workshop that had been born among flour and leather, obsessed with improving the performance of athletes, now participates in a context of organized violence that surpasses any initial intention. Meanwhile, Adi, focused on his technical vision, continues trying to maintain a small core of production connected to sport. He clings to the idea that someday the war will end and athletes will return to the track. But with each season it becomes more evident that the country is sinking into a spiral of destruction. Air raid sirens interrupt work. The factory adapts as best it can to the shifts in production, and in the atmosphere the smell of leather mixes with the fear of bombings. Rudolf, more involved in the sphere of political and economic contacts, moves with ease among offices and desks, something that will later fuel a climate of distrust within the family itself, because every gesture will be interpreted through the filter of survival and personal loyalties. As time passes, the war turns against Germany, defeats accumulate, the Allies advance, and the map that once was colored with triumphant tones fills with collapsing fronts. As United States and Soviet troops draw near, many factories fear becoming legitimate military targets, because any installation that could serve the production of war material is a candidate for destruction. The Dassler plant is no exception. From the sky, it is difficult to distinguish a boot factory from one that produces weapons components, and in the final months of the conflict, tension multiplies with every distant sound of engines. The scene that is repeated again and again when speaking of this period has something of a film and much of a historical breaking point. According to the accounts, a group of United States soldiers arrives in the town, identifies the factory as a potential target, and considers blowing it up to prevent it from continuing to serve the German war machinery. At that moment, Kathy, Adi's wife, steps in. She approaches the soldiers and explains, with the urgency of someone who knows that the future of many families is being decided, that this is not a weapons plant, that shoes are made there, that there was production for the army, yes, but that the essence of the workshop is tied to sport and to a sector of the population that only wants to live in peace again. It is difficult to imagine the mixture of nerves, fear, and hope she must have felt in that decisive minute. But the version that survives is clear. She convinces the soldiers not to destroy the building, and the factory is saved. The damage that the war leaves in every realm of life is immense, impossible to repair in many cases. Yet that particular building remains standing, with its machines, its tables, and its potential to become, years later, the place from which the three stripes would spread around the world. That it survived thanks to that intervention does not erase the responsibility of what occurred during the conflict, but it does explain why the workshop remained when so many others were reduced to ruins. With the end of the war comes the Allied occupation and the denazification process. Commissions and tribunals analyze who did what, who benefited, who was a promoter, and who was a follower of the regime. Adi and Rudolf are interrogated. Their affiliations, contracts, and relationships with party figures are examined, and in order to maintain the license that allows them to continue producing, they must convince the new authorities that the factory can be transformed into a clean enterprise, focused on sport and capable of operating in a democratic environment. It is a period of crossed statements, veiled accusations, and family tensions that deepen, because each brother tries to present his own role in the best possible light, while dragging along resentments accumulated over years of war and differences in character. The post-war period does not bring a clean slate. It brings a mixture of guilt, the need to move forward, and economic urgency, especially in small towns that depend on industrial employment to avoid social collapse. The Dasslers company finds itself at that crossroads. It has a productive structure, it has technical knowledge, it has a name that is becoming known in the world of sport. But it also carries a recent past that nobody can ignore. The brothers understand that if they want the project to continue, they will need to definitively redirect production towards sport and recover that original idea that had given them purpose in the 1920s, without forgetting that those observing them are no longer only athletes and coaches, but also authorities and neighbors who have suffered too much. That tense context, marked by reconstruction, distrust, and open wounds, will be the stage in which the relationship between Adi and Rudolf deteriorates irreversibly, to the point of transforming their partnership into a personal conflict from which two rival companies and a divided town will be born for generations. The Great Divorce, Adidas against Puma. When the war ends and the Allied troops settle in Germany, the noise of the bombs gives way to a strange silence, a silence in which people begin counting absences, calculating damage, and wondering how to rebuild a normal life on ground covered with scars. In Herzogenaurach, the factory building of the Dassler family remains standing thanks to that desperate negotiation by Kethe. But what is not so clear is whether the people who inhabit it are still the same as they were before the war, because the years of political tension, interrogations, suspicions, and small everyday gestures have accumulated a weight that is now felt in every conversation. The workshop begins once again producing athletic footwear. Demand grows little by little, and the world of sports needs reliable suppliers. However, within the family and within the company itself, the harmony of earlier times is now only a distant memory. Adi increasingly takes refuge in design and technique, trying to concentrate on lasts, on lightness, on new ideas for football and track shoes, while Rudolf continues to be the one in charge of negotiating, of speaking with authorities, of moving among clients and contacts who, in this occupied Germany, are essential for obtaining licenses, raw materials, and contracts. On paper, the division of tasks makes sense, but beneath that apparent logic hide reproaches that are not fully spoken. Adi suspects that Rudy cared too much about his own status during the war. Rudy believes that Adi and his circle have spoken more than necessary with the Americans to save the factory and protect certain positions. Nothing explodes yet, but everything wounds. The small stories of daily life add to this feeling of distrust, and there is an anecdote that has been told again and again because it captures very well the tense atmosphere of those years. During a bombing, the whole family takes refuge in a basement. In the midst of the roar, when the planes fly over the city, Adi enters the shelter and, upon hearing the power of the explosions, says something along the lines of, "Here come those pigs again," referring to the Allied planes that threatened to destroy everything. Rudolf, already inside, interprets that comment as being directed at him and his people, feeling that his own brother sees him as a burden or as a domestic enemy, and that misunderstanding becomes another splinter in a relationship that had already been damaged. It is a minimal episode if we compare it to what was happening in the world, but sometimes those intimate, poorly explained scenes end up tipping the balance. As the denazification process moves forward, the Allies investigate the involvement of various figures in the previous regime, and Rudolf spends a period under arrest, accused of having played a more committed role in the party than he is willing to admit. Meanwhile, Adi and Kethe take charge of keeping the factory running and convincing the authorities that the business is, above all, a source of employment and a supplier of sporting goods, something that fits well with the new Germany that seeks to build itself around less militarized values. From Rudy's perspective, that period is the beginning of a betrayal, because he experiences his arrest as proof that someone within his own circle has pointed to his name with more intensity than to that of others. And although reality is more complex, perception weighs heavily when pride, fear, and accumulated resentment mix. When Rudolf emerges from that ordeal, the company continues operating, but the internal hierarchy has shifted. Adi appears as the technical and moral reference before the Allies, while Rudy feels that part of his role and legitimacy has been taken from him. From that moment on, every decision becomes a battleground. No matter whether it involves hiring a new employee, signing an agreement with a distributor, or choosing the direction of a product line, what once was resolved through intense but constructive discussion transforms into bitter confrontation. Workers notice that the brothers exchange glances filled with reproach, that they argue behind closed doors for hours, that they leave meetings with hardened expressions, and that tension ends up filtering through to the workforce, which begins whispering about how long such a situation can last. The factory, which had been a symbol of family unity and local pride, becomes a setting where every hallway seems to have an owner, where each group of employees feels closer to one brother or the other. Some admire Adi's silent obsession, his way of perfecting the product without resting, his almost artisanal relationship with each new shoe. Others identify with Rudolf's energy, with his ability to secure contracts, with his sense of commercial risk, and his expansive personality. What, in another context, might have been a valuable complementarity is here broken into two irreconcilable blocks, because the emotional glue that once held them together has dissolved among guilt, rivalry, and unhealed wounds. Finally, the inevitable becomes reality. Rudolf decides to leave the company. It is not an orderly or calm departure. It is a dramatic rupture, filled with mutual accusations, with words that had been accumulating for years and now burst out all at once. Accounts are separated, assets are distributed, arguments drag on endlessly about what belongs to whom, which contracts remain with the old company, and which will accompany the one who leaves. Once the decision is made, the next step is to give a name and structure to this new entrepreneurial venture. And here appears the first visible mutation of what, in time, will become a legendary duel in the history of sports and business. Rudolf founds his own company in 1948, initially with a name that mixes syllables of his own name and surname, something that sounds more technical than inspiring, and that soon transforms into Puma, a short, direct word filled with feline strength, designed to evoke speed, agility, and aggressiveness on the playing field. He sets himself up on the opposite side of the river that runs through Herzogenaurach, chooses different land, builds his own facilities, and begins hiring people. Many who had worked in the old factory are forced to choose a side. Some leave with Rudy out of personal loyalty or confidence in his ability to sell any idea he sets his mind to. Others stay with Adi, convinced that the heart of the business lies in the quality of the product, in the obsession with detail, and in the historic relationship with elite athletes. Little by little, the entire town becomes divided into two halves that almost never mix. There are bars where those who work for one company gather, and others where those of the opposing side prefer to meet. There are families in which some members sign with Puma and others with the old factory. There are shops that buy preferentially from one of the two suppliers, and it is even said that children learn, without anyone formally explaining it, in which houses it is advisable to enter depending on the shoes one is wearing. Herzogenaurach becomes an almost caricature-like microcosm of business rivalry. Two athletic footwear companies, born from the same family tree, competing street by street, locker room by locker room, field by field. Meanwhile, Adi faces a colossal challenge. It is not enough to have preserved the building and part of the workforce. Now he must give a new identity to a company that can no longer present itself simply as the factory of the Dassler brothers, because that concept has been broken forever. He needs a name, a brand that can travel across the languages of different countries, a symbol that distinguishes his products from those of his brother and from the rest of the competitors. It is the moment to separate, once and for all, the lives of two entrepreneurs who grew up together, who shared oven, workshop, and dreams, but who will now develop completely divergent visions of what a sports brand should be. At that crossroads, with the town divided, with the personal relationship shattered, and with the global sports market beginning to awaken from the nightmare of the war, Adi sits before a blank sheet of paper to decide what he wants his company to be called and how he wants his work to be recognized in any stadium on the planet. From that decision onward, the project will cease to be merely the continuation of an earlier story and will become something new, with its own name, its own visual identity, and an ambition that already looks far beyond the borders of Herzogenaurach. The birth of Adidas and the Three Stripes. When Rudolf has already moved to the other side of the river and the town begins to grow accustomed to that silent fracture that divides families, bars, and locker rooms, Adi remains in the old factory surrounded by machines, lasts, and employees who have chosen to stay with him, but also by something that weighs more than any soul, the urgent need to give a name and face to a company that can no longer be defined as the one of the Dassler brothers, because that time has ended for good. The building is the same. The hands that sew are many of the same ones as before. The technical recipes are in his head, although without a clear identity, without a simple word that can be pronounced in any language. The project runs the risk of dissolving in a market that will grow rapidly as soon as sport recovers the place it had before the war. Adi has never been a man of grand speeches, of those who fill boards with abstract concepts, but he understands perfectly that brands live in people's memory, and that in order to live there, they need a name that sticks, that is easy to remember, that can be written on a cardboard box, on an invoice, on a sign in a stadium. In that process of searching, the solution ends up being so close that at first it hardly seems like a real idea. Taking his nickname, Adi, joining it with the first letters of his surname, Dassler, and condensing it into a compact and rounded word that sounds equally natural in the mouth of a German, a Frenchman, or a Brazilian. Thus, in the year 1949, Adidas is officially born, a name that seems obvious when looking back, but which at that moment is a small act of courage because he decides to place his own identity, his personal and family history, at the front of a company that aspires to go much further than his city. The registration of the brand, with its stamped papers and dates, makes tangible a transformation that had been taking shape for some time. And gradually that name begins to appear in correspondence, in orders, in the artisanal catalogs the company sends to clubs and distributors. However, Adi knows that the world of sport is experienced at a distance, from the stands, from the home sofa, from a newspaper photograph, and that in that context a name written in small print is not enough. A sign is needed that can be recognized from dozens of meters away, that distinguishes his products when a player runs down the wing or a sprinter leans forward in the starting blocks, a sort of visual signature that does not depend on reading but on identifying at a glance. In the workshop, the search for that distinctive element begins, as so many other things in the life of Adidas, from a functional need, reinforcing the lateral part of the shoe to give more stability to the foot in changes of direction, so that the leather does not give too much when the player turns sharply or the runner lands forcefully on the curve. Adi experiments with strips of material sewn onto the body of the shoe, with different widths and positions, and he notices that this technical reinforcement, which originally served to protect the structure of the footwear, also creates a very clear figure on the surface, a sort of graphic imprint that, repeated again and again, could become a symbol. The first versions are not yet the 3 stripes we know today, but they already point in that direction, diagonal or slightly inclined bands that cross the side of the shoe, and that, with time, stabilize into that simple triptych that anyone can draw on a piece of paper without needing to be a designer. The discovery lies precisely there, in the combination of utility and simplicity. The stripes support, reinforce, prevent the leather from deforming, and at the same time, create a pattern that is engraved in the spectator's memory effortlessly, almost like a traffic sign of sport. At this point enters an anecdote that, repeated over and over, has become one of those episodes every lover of brand history enjoys telling. The stripes as a concept already existed in another company, the Finnish company, Karhu, also specialized in athletic footwear, which had long been using a line motif in its products. When Adi becomes aware that this resource could be the visual heart of his project, he understands that he must secure the usage rights clearly and legally, and he negotiates with the Finns an agreement that, seen today, seems almost unbelievable. In exchange for a relatively modest amount of money and 2 bottles of whiskey, Adidas acquires the right to use the 3 stripes as a symbol, an agreement that at the time must have seemed reasonable for both parties, without anyone being able to imagine the multi-million value that gesture would reach in the following decades. Once the idea is consolidated and the legal aspect resolved, the 3 stripes begin to spread throughout the entire range of footwear. They appear on football boots designed for muddy fields, on running shoes made for cinder tracks, on experimental models destined for training. At first, some customers perceive them as a simple decoration, a touch of style on the usual base, but with time a shift in perception occurs. The stripes cease to be an ornament and become a mental shortcut, the way spectators Identify in fractions of a second which athlete is wearing Adidas in a sea of shirts and colors. The rivalry with Puma, which quickly consolidates in regional leagues and national championships, helps reinforce that identity. On the same fields, where before only the Dassler brothers were discussed, now people debate which boots offer better traction, which sole lasts longer, which symbol inspires more respect, the feline ready to leap, or the three lines that cut across the side of the boot. Coaches and players grow accustomed to expressing their preferences in almost tribal terms, and in every locker room, a silent battle unfolds between boxes, with cats printed on them, and boxes marked with stripes, between recently signed contracts and promises of future sponsorships. With time, Adi understands that the reach of the symbol can go beyond footwear, and he dares to extend it to clothing, tracksuits, shirts, training pants. The seams on the shoulders and sleeves become new canvases for the three stripes, which rise from the feet to the torso, drawing a coherent visual language that allows, at a glance, to know if a team is equipped from head to toe by the same company. That decision, which today seems natural, was at the time a very advanced way of understanding the brand as a complete system and not as a succession of isolated objects, a way of building presence on the field through the disciplined repetition of the same sign. From the point of view of entrepreneurship, the interesting aspect of this stage is that it shows how a graphic element can become a first-order strategic tool when managed with coherence. The three stripes are extremely simple, but behind that simplicity lies a very concrete intelligence. Choosing a symbol easy to reproduce, adaptable to different materials, visible in motion, and neutral enough to coexist with shirts of any color. Adi, who was not an artist in the classical sense, did have an intuitive understanding of what it means for a product to be recognizable in any context, and that understanding led him to bet on a visual identity that today is one of the most powerful on the planet. As the name Adidas becomes consolidated in catalogs, invoices, and commercial agreements, the three stripes begin to settle in the eyes of coaches, players, and fans, preparing the ground for the next great phase of growth. The definitive conquest of the most popular sport in the world, that in which a single important match can completely change the fortune of a boot brand that dares to innovate where others continue repeating formulas from the past. The miracle of Berne in football. At the beginning of the decade of 1950, Europe was trying to breathe again after the disaster of the war, and in that effort to rebuild itself, sport played a role that went beyond entertainment, because in many countries it became a place where people could project hope, pride, and a certain sense of normality. In the Federal Republic of Germany, still marked by defeat and division, football was transformed into a common language capable of uniting generations that had lived through very different things, and while children once again filled empty lots with improvised balls. In Herzogenaurach, inside the Adidas factory, Adi Dassler watched that phenomenon with the eyes of someone who understood that a unique opportunity was opening for his company and for his own personal story. Until then, Adidas had already become strong in athletics, with lightweight shoes and spikes adjusted to each discipline. But Adi perceived that football had something different. A track and field event was decided in seconds and followed with attention, although not everyone understood the nuances of each test. Whereas football was shared, discussed at work, argued about in the bar, and played on any corner, and a ball rolling over grass, mud, or dirt was capable of capturing the attention of millions of people at the same time. In that context, a boot was not merely a piece of leather with studs, it was the tool with which a player could become a national hero for 90 minutes. Adi began dedicating more and more time to analyzing how football players moved, what kind of effort they made, how they anchored themselves to the ground when breaking, how they lost balance when the field was soft or excessively dry, and that study led him to a very clear conclusion. The great problem of the footwear of the era was its rigidity, both in the structure of the boot and in the studs, which were usually fixed, made of leather or rubber, designed to last but incapable of adapting to the changing conditions of the playing surface. The result was that when the rain arrived and the grass became a slippery carpet, players lost traction, slid, felt insecure with every turn, and that invisible fear shaped their way of playing. Instead of resigning himself to that limit, Adi conceived a system that would allow the boot to adjust to the field as if it were a modifiable tool, something the football player could adapt according to the state of the grass. From that idea came the concept of interchangeable studs, small elements screwed into the sole that could be lengthened or shortened, changed in material, and even in quantity, depending on whether the ground was dry, wet, or muddy. The concept seems simple when we hear it now, but at that time it represented a small revolution, because it required rethinking the structure of the sole, the resistance of the material, how to fix the studs so they would not come loose in the middle of a match, and it required convincing coaches and players that the mechanism would not fail at the least convenient moment. While the first prototypes of boots with screw-in studs were being adjusted in the factory, in the offices of the German Federation, preparations were underway for the participation of the national team in the World Cup of 1954, which would be played in Switzerland. Germany did not arrive as a favorite, not even close. The great team of the moment was Hungary, the famous selection of the magical Magyars, led by Ferenc Puskás, a group that had spent years overwhelming its opponents with offensive and brilliant play that seemed from another galaxy. Adi, however, saw in that tournament the perfect opportunity to show what his innovation was capable of, and he began working closely with the German coach and the equipment staff so that the team would travel with Adidas boots adapted to the new technology. The coaches, at first, looked with caution at the idea of interchangeable studs, because any new element introduced so close to match day could be perceived as a risk. However, the way Adi approached them, his manner of explaining how the boot behaved on different surfaces, his willingness to adjust each pair according to the specific needs of each player, eventually generated trust. When the German team settled in Switzerland, it brought with it a tool that many other delegations did not yet know at all. Boots capable of adapting to the field in a matter of minutes without the need to replace them entirely. The tournament advanced. Germany progressed with football that was less brilliant than Hungary's, but very disciplined, physical, and resilient. And the Swiss weather introduced a factor that would prove decisive. Rain. The fields became soaked, the grass grew heavy and slippery, and suddenly the choice of footwear stopped being a minor detail and became one of the key elements in every match. In the German locker room, before each game, a scene was repeated that showed how deeply Adi was involved in the project. He knelt in front of the boots, changed the studs, lengthened them to increase grip, checked them one by one, and made sure that every player went onto the field with the configuration suitable for the real conditions of the ground and not merely for those predicted on paper. The final arrived on the 4th of July of 1954 in the Wankdorf Stadion of Berne, with a script that many believed was written before the ball even began to roll. Hungary, which had defeated Germany with ease in the group stage, appeared as the absolute favorite, while the German team seemed, in the eyes of the world, little more than a worthy challenger that would do what it could. Rain fell over the stadium, the field was drenched, and in that setting, the Hungarians stepped out with traditional boots, robust but not adaptable, while the Germans tied their Adidas boots with lengthened studs, prepared to bite into the mud with every step. In the first minutes, logic seemed to prevail. Hungary took the lead, demonstrated its technical quality and its capacity for combination play, and many believed that the match would be another straightforward chapter in the long list of exhibitions the team had delivered for years. However, as the minutes passed, something less visible from the stands but very evident for anyone on the grass began to occur. The Germans held firmly to the ground, braked better, turned with greater security, and rose more quickly after each fall, while the legs of the Hungarians began to show fatigue, seeking support on a surface that was becoming increasingly treacherous. The match turned around. Germany equalized, then took the lead, and what had seemed like a closed script became a monumental surprise that would be remembered for decades as the Miracle of Berne. Theodor Toni Turek, Fritz Walter, Helmut Rahn, and their teammates became national heroes. The country celebrated the title as a symbolic first step toward the recovery of its self-esteem after the horror of the war. And in the black and white photographs of that afternoon, one can see, if one pays attention, that many of those heroes wore on their feet the 3 stripes of Adidas. It would be an exaggeration to claim that the boots won the final by themselves. Football is complex, mixing tactics, physical condition, emotional state, and individual talent. But the difference in traction on a waterlogged field was a real factor that influenced how the match unfolded. For Adidas, the impact of that world title went far beyond the pride of a supporter, because it confirmed something he had been defending since the beginning of his career. When a product is designed intelligently to solve the user's concrete problems, it becomes a competitive advantage that reveals itself even in moments of maximum pressure. From that day on, Adidas ceased to be merely the footwear company of Herzogenaurach and became the boots of the world champions, a label with incalculable value when it came to opening doors in federations, clubs, and sports shops throughout Europe. Coaches from other countries asked about those boots with interchangeable studs. Players who had watched the match wanted to try them. Distributors who had hesitated to place larger orders began to bet decisively on the three stripes, because they had seen that in the most demanding scenario possible, against a rival superior on paper, the boots had proven their effectiveness. In the factory, the effect of the title was felt in the volume of work, in the energy of the staff, in the sense of participating in something that transcended the simple act of sewing leather and screwing studs. Those who woke each morning to join the production line felt that their effort had translated into a historic moment that the entire country carried in its memory. Adi, true to his character, did not allow himself to be blinded by euphoria, but he understood that the leap they had just taken was enormous, and that from that moment onward, every major international tournament would be a battle where the playing field would also be a showcase for his brand. That momentum achieved in Berne would shape the strategy of Adidas during the decades that followed, because it cemented the idea that the future of the company depended on being present in every major stage of world sport, signing agreements with national teams, clubs, and athletes, and turning performance into the central argument of an identity that would look less and less to its village of origin and more to the entire map of the planet. From Bavarian workshop to global brand, after the World Cup of 1954, while all of Germany relives that triumph as if it had ignited a collective spark impossible to capture in words, something happens inside the factory in Herzogenaurach that goes far beyond a moment of celebration. The atmosphere gains a different pulse, a mixture of confidence and vertigo that makes it clear the company has crossed a point of no return. The three stripes are no longer a local symbol nor a technical detail appreciated only by a few specialists. They have transformed into a mark, associated with visible performance, the kind of gesture capable of tipping the history of a decisive match. That change in scale is profound, because it forces the company to rethink how to produce, how to distribute, and how to present brand and product to a world that, after the war, is beginning to open once again to international trade. While orders arrive from different corners of Europe, Adi understands that growth cannot be based only on producing more pairs or improving machines. He needs a structure that connects his working philosophy with athletes, federations, and organizers of sporting events in other countries, something that he, always enclosed between workbenches, is not in a position to lead directly. And it is here that the figure of his son Horst enters decisively into the history of Adidas. Horst, much younger, with a pragmatic and ambitious outlook, understands that elite sport does not live solely on the field, but also in the offices where it is decided which brands are linked to which competitions and under what conditions. Unlike his father, who had become accustomed to earning the trust of athletes with boots in hand and technical arguments, Horst perceives that the future of the business depends on weaving lasting relationships with institutions, coaches, Olympic committees, and federation leaders. For him, every athlete is a door, every national team is a vehicle for visibility, and every competition is a stage where the brand can multiply its impact. With that clear vision, he begins to travel, to attend congresses, to appear in meetings where until then, Adidas had been a name that barely appeared on secondary lists. His presence introduces a new energy, young, strategic, aware that the brand needs to move with more agility than its competitors to secure a permanent place in the elite. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, that approach begins to bear fruit. Adidas no longer appears at major sporting events as an occasional supplier, but as a company integrated into the rhythm of the event, working with athletes before, during, and after the competition. The brand supplies footwear for different disciplines, adopts technologies that allow the design to adapt to the specific needs of each athlete, and develops complete product lines that do not merely repeat formulas, but evolve. With each tournament, Horst has an extraordinary ability to identify athletes with media potential, and above all, to understand that a collaboration does not need to be based solely on an exchange of product, but on the creation of a relationship of trust that reaches the cameras, the newspapers, and the general public. The presence of Adidas grows rapidly at the Olympic Games in Melbourne in 1956 and later in Rome in 1960, where multiple medal winners compete with shoes manufactured in Herzogenaurach. The photographs of the finals begin to show, more and more frequently, the unmistakable pattern of the three stripes, and commentators, even without the sophistication of modern media, begin to mention the brand naturally when discussing certain achievements. Each mention, each victory, each image frozen on a front page amplifies the sensation that Adidas no longer belongs exclusively to Germany, but is expanding its influence into territories where, until recently, its name had not even circulated. Football remains a central engine of that expansion. European clubs demand high-quality equipment for their players. National leagues enter a more organized phase of professionalization, and Adidas introduces technical improvements in boots that adapt to different types of grass, new tactics, and more intense physical demands. In England, France, Italy, and Spain, more and more teams begin to incorporate products of the brand, and that progressive European penetration prepares the ground for something even larger. The growing prominence of Adidas in the World Cups following the miracle of Berne. The World Cup of 1958 in Sweden reinforces this trend, although Brazil dazzles the planet with an adolescent named Pelé, who redefines the notion of talent. The interest in the sports equipment used in the tournament multiplies, and Adidas benefits from that increased attention. Horst knows that constant presence in events of that magnitude is not guaranteed by inertia. It requires contracts, negotiations, long-term agreements, and above all, the construction of a solid reputation around the reliability of the product, which must withstand extreme conditions, long travel, and a demanding calendar. That understanding of sport as a network of relationships leads Adidas to consolidate its presence not only in footwear, but also in balls, sports, clothing, and accessories. The objective, although not expressed openly, is that the brand not be perceived as a reputable shoe factory, but as a company capable of outfitting sport from beginning to end. The strategy is not merely to sell products, but to become part of the atmosphere of the competitions themselves. Locker rooms, exit tunnels, press conferences, public training sessions, all of them turned into spaces where the brand can speak without words through design and visual coherence. Every step forward requires adjusting the company's internal structure. Production increases, new technologies are incorporated, warehouses are expanded, and processes are modernized. The factory begins to resemble less a large workshop and more an industrial company that combines heavy machinery with precise craftsmanship. Because, although production scales, Adi continues, insisting on supervising prototypes, testing new materials, and consulting the athletes who trust him. That balance between corporate growth and obsessive care for technical detail becomes one of the keys to the success of Adidas, and also a distinctive trait compared to other competitors who begin to professionalize with an approach more oriented toward mass production. As the brand expands physically, it also expands symbolically. The three stripes become an emblem recognized from the stands, even when the athlete is in motion. The public learns to distinguish, almost unconsciously, those parallel lines that accompany runners, football players, and boxers across multiple international stages. This visual familiarity becomes a strategic advantage because it creates an emotional connection with millions of spectators who, without realizing it, begin to associate triumph, elegance, and professionalism with that brand, born in a family workshop decades earlier. Horst, who acts as a bridge between his father's artisan vision and the global ambition demanded by an expanding market, develops novel methods to manage contracts, anticipate product needs, and position the brand before competitors react. His ability to anticipate the moves of other companies turns Adidas into a dominant actor in international sports. consolidating a structure that does not depend solely on sporting results, but on an intelligent relationship between innovation, emerging marketing, and institutional presence. In that climate of continuous growth, Adidas enters a phase in which the brand no longer limits itself to accompanying athletes, but defines trends, influences the understanding of sports equipment, and sets the path for an entire industry that, until then, had functioned in a more artisanal and dispersed manner. Agreements with federations and clubs become increasingly sophisticated, and the company begins to understand that it is not enough to produce well. It must know how to tell the story behind each technical advance, each design, each athlete who trusts the brand. Toward the end of the 1960s, as the Olympic Games become global spectacles broadcast on television and football begins to acquire a media dimension without precedent, Adidas is already emerging as a company that no longer belongs exclusively to the town that saw it born. It now forms part of the international conversation about sport, and that prominence opens doors to emerging markets, more ambitious collaborations, and challenges that will test its ability to manage a success growing faster than anyone could have imagined some years earlier. That constant ascent also anticipates that the brand will have to face difficult decisions to sustain its momentum, because no prolonged growth is free of internal tensions, leadership changes, or the challenges of an increasingly competitive market. Crisis, Tapie, and almost total ruin. Throughout the decade of 1970, while Adidas continues expanding across stadiums and tracks all over the planet, within the company a different atmosphere begins to grow compared to the heroic years, a thicker air, the kind that surrounds companies that have reached such size that inertia, at times, seems to replace the creative drive that once initiated them. The sports market becomes more complex. Competition grows with new emerging brands in the United States that understand modern marketing in a more aggressive way. And at the same time, the Dassler family goes through a period marked by personal losses, changes in leadership, and a silent wearing down of the internal structure. The decisive blow arrives in the year 1978, when Adi Dassler passes away, leaving behind an immense legacy, but also a disstory, void that neither contracts nor reputation can fill easily. The death of Adi marks a before and after, because his presence was not merely that of a symbolic founder. It was the presence of an obsessive craftsman who reviewed prototypes, gave his opinion on every innovation, and transmitted a philosophy of work that connected technique with intuition. With him disappears the emotional pillar that kept the project cohesive, and the leadership of the company passes to his family, headed by his son Horst, who for years had demonstrated a surprising ability to expand Adidas around the world, especially through intelligent control of sponsorships, sports agreements, and institutional relationships. However, the weight that falls upon him after his father's death is not the same as before, because now he must balance strategic vision with the daily management of a structure that grows heavier and more dependent on quick decisions. The economic landscape of federal Germany becomes complicated. The international market grows more competitive, and new actors, among them Nike and other brands from the United States, burst in with a creative aggressiveness that contrasts with the more traditional style of Adidas. The competition begins presenting bolder models, advertising campaigns with global stars, and a narrative centered on youth and personal performance, while Adidas, confident in its history and prestige, moves more slowly, as if past success served as an excuse to postpone necessary decisions. And although Horst works tirelessly, the pressure on him grows to limits difficult to sustain. In the year 1987, when Horst Dassler unexpectedly dies at 51 years of age, the company enters one of the most delicate moments in its history. Suddenly, Adidas is left without the figure who had acted as a bridge between the heritage of Adi and the global future of the brand. The death of Horst not only creates an emotional void, but a leadership void that the internal structures were not prepared to fill smoothly. Without him, the continuity that allowed the company to maintain its link with federations, Olympic committees, and sports organizations that trusted its ability to offer quick solutions and personalized treatment collapses. After that loss, Adidas finds itself trapped between two contradictory forces. On one hand, the urgent need to modernize and adapt to a market that moves faster each day. On the other hand, a family structure that, although full of good intentions, lacks the business focus required of a global company that can no longer be managed like an enlarged workshop. Sales begin to stagnate, the product catalog becomes confusing, and young consumers start leaning toward brands that represent a fresher aesthetic and a more contemporary narrative. Adidas still has prestige, but prestige without action can become a thin layer of varnish that peels off with every lost season. In that climate of uncertainty, the company makes several strategic mistakes that accelerate its fall. It launches products with little impact, it delays adopting technologies already incorporated by its competition, and it loses ground in the United States, where the rise of Nike becomes a cultural phenomenon. For the most experienced executives, it becomes evident that the company needs a new approach, someone capable of making tough decisions and shaking off the dust accumulated through years of inertia. And it is in that scenario, at the end of the 1980s, that a character as controversial as charismatic appears: Bernard Tapie. Tapie was a French businessman of ambivalent reputation, known for his ability to acquire companies in crisis and transform them through unorthodox methods. His public image was that of a bold negotiator, capable of generating headlines both for his successes and for his scandals. A man who understood the power of television and who used his magnetic personality to influence markets, people, and decisions. When it is announced that he has purchased Adidas, many feel a mixture of intrigue, nervousness, and hope, because his arrival symbolizes, in some way, the idea that someone is willing to do what no one inside the family wanted or could do: modernize, cut, reorganize, take risks. One of Tapie's first moves is to relocate much of the production to Asia, especially to countries where labor costs are lower, with the objective of reducing expenses and allowing the company to compete in price with rivals that had already been manufacturing outside Europe for years. This change, although unpopular among those who valued the artisanal tradition of the brand, proves inevitable from a business perspective, because margins had shrunk so much that Adidas was losing the economic battle even before stepping onto the field. Tapie also introduces more aggressive marketing strategies, attempts to rejuvenate the brand's image, and begins promoting collaborations with public figures outside the strictly sports environment. However, Tapie's style, based on quick decisions and bold moves, clashes with a company that had spent decades functioning under a different logic, slower and dependent on long-term relationships. Many inside Adidas see his methods as an invasion, a frontal collision with the company's identity. Added to that are external financial problems, legal accusations, and an enormous personal debt that eventually drags him down. In a matter of a few years, Tapie goes from being the expected savior to becoming a source of instability, a figure surrounded by controversy that generates more doubts than certainties in the markets. The French bank Crédit Lyonnais intervenes to prevent a greater collapse, takes temporary control of Adidas, and initiates a restructuring process that, although more discreet and less media-driven than Tapie's moves, becomes essential to prevent the brand from disappearing. During that period, Adidas lives through a gray phase, without clear leadership, without a coherent vision, and with a weakened identity. Those who worked inside the company remember those years as a strange time, in which the company seemed to exist inside an uncomfortable pause, waiting for someone, though it was not clear who, to appear with a plan capable of restoring its pulse. That sensation of emptiness is particularly symbolic because it contrasts with the company's history, a history built on decisive choices, technical innovations, and strong leadership, from the figure of Adi to the international drive of Horst. And in the middle of that absence of direction, the world of sports continues advancing at full speed. New materials, new leagues, athletes turned into global icons, sponsorship strategies that completely reshape the end. Relationship between athlete and brand. Adidas runs the risk of remaining anchored to a glorious past that, with each passing year, becomes less useful for competing. But as occurs in the great business stories, the companies that survive are not necessarily the ones that never fall, but the ones that manage to rise after a blow that seemed definitive. And at that exact point, when Adidas appears to be losing the rhythm of the world it helped build, the change that will mark the brand's entry into a new era begins to take form. 90s Renaissance and stock market debut. when it seems that Adidas has lost the rhythm of the world it helped build, when its three stripes remain recognizable but no longer set trends in the wardrobes of young people, nor on the covers of sports magazines, something happens that tends to repeat itself in the history of many great brands. Someone from the outside arrives, looks at the company with unsentimental eyes, and decides that, if it wants to stay alive, it will have to change its skin without denying the skeleton that holds it up. At the beginning of the decade of 1990, that someone is a new management team that takes control after the tumultuous stage of Bernard Tapie and the bank that had temporarily taken over the reins. The new leadership arrives with a clear conviction. Adidas still has a story too powerful to become a dusty memory on the bonnet shelf of sport. The internal diagnosis is direct and painful in equal measure. The brand has fallen asleep in nostalgia. Its catalog is fragmented. Its messages have become diffuse, and its ability to connect with the young public has fallen far behind that of its competitors. The solution cannot be a simple facelift. It requires a profound restructuring that touches product, communication, organization, and the way success is measured. In this new stage, the company decides to focus on three axes that will serve as the backbone of the Renaissance, returning athletic performance to the center of the narrative, organizing the product portfolio into clear families, and working the brand with a sensitivity more aligned with the visual and cultural language of the 90s. From that review emerges the equipment line, presented as a kind of declaration of intent, instead of competing, to see who adds more ornaments, colors, and extravagant shapes. Equipment is offered as the essential, the strictly necessary to perform at the highest level. Robust materials, functional design, sober aesthetics. The campaigns associated with this range recover an idea that had always been in the DNA of Adidas, but had faded over the years. The product as a precise tool, as an extension of the athlete's body. This shift not only seeks to reconnect with the professional athlete, it also sends a clear message to the everyday user who trains in the park or at the gym after work. If you want something serious, you can trust us again. At the same time, on football fields, a boot begins to appear that will become an icon in its own right, the Predator line. Inspired by the idea of improving contact with the ball and the effect of strikes, the boot incorporates zones of ribbed rubber and a construction that alters the way the foot transmits strength and touch. Beyond technical effectiveness, Predator has something very valuable: a distinct aesthetic, aggressive without becoming strident, easy to recognize even in distant television shots. Great figures of European and global football lace up those boots in decisive matches, and every strike that ends in a goal reinforces, in the minds of millions of viewers, the feeling that Adidas is once again at the forefront of the game, not only in its memory. This product momentum is accompanied by an internal reorganization that affects all levels of the company. Production is rationalized, business categories are defined more clearly, logistics are improved, and presence in key markets is reinforced, especially in the United States of America, where the brand had yielded too much ground. A more professionalized management approach is adopted, with clear objectives for growth, profitability, and financial structure. The romanticism of the family workshop is framed as the origin of a story of which they are proud, but the present is already conceived as a multinational corporation that must be efficient, flexible, and fast. In parallel, communication takes a qualitative leap. Advertising campaigns begin to speak the language of a generation that has grown up with television as a window to the world, one that mixes sport with music, cinema, and urban culture. The advertisements are no longer limited to showing athletes executing technical gestures, but rather tell small stories, transmit emotions, play with epic elements and vulnerability, and incorporate powerful images of training, effort, failure, and overcoming. The three stripes, which had run the risk of being associated only with adults who remembered old achievements, reappear on posters stuck in the bedrooms of teenagers and in the entrances of buildings where the ball bounces against the walls at all hours. This entire reconstruction process has a clear financial objective: restoring to Adidas the solidity necessary to play in the same league as other major publicly traded companies, with access to capital, disciplined results, and transparency for investors. In 1995, the company takes a symbolic and practical step at the same time by entering the stock market. The public offering of shares represents, in one stroke, a change of historical stage, from an extended family business with decisions concentrated among a few surnames, to a joint stock company accountable to thousands of shareholders across different countries. The stock market debut forces Adidas to look at itself in a more demanding mirror, because from then on, it will no longer be enough to have good products and a strong presence in sport. It will also be necessary to present clear accounts, explain strategies to analysts, endure the pressure of quarterly results, and maintain a coherent narrative about the future of the brand. This environment, which to some romantics may seem cold, also has a positive disciplining effect. Projects that do not fit the general vision are eliminated, investments that make sense are prioritized, and a balance is sought between passion for sport, which remains the heart of the brand, and the need to generate sustained value. The transformation of the 90s is not limited to numbers and structures. It also changes the relationship of Adidas with popular culture. In neighborhoods across Europe and America, the brand's jackets, sweatshirts, and sneakers begin to blend with urban styles, with hip-hop scenes, with movements that use sportswear as a declaration of identity. Without fully planning it at the beginning, the company discovers that it can speak at the same time to the professional athlete preparing for an Olympic Games and to the young person listening to music on a street corner while playing football on a concrete court. That dual reading of the product as a high-performance tool and as a symbol of belonging will be key in the decades to come. During this stage, the balance between the old and the new becomes especially delicate. It is necessary to honor the history of Adi, of Horst, of the years of glory in World Cups and games, but at the same time it is necessary to accept that the world of the 90s demands another rhythm and another type of response. The renaissance of Adidas is sustained precisely in that ability to keep the essence alive: obsession with performance, close relationship with athletes, functional design, while accepting new rules in finance, culture, and technology. In terms of entrepreneurship, the lesson from this period is very clear. A brand can hit bottom without ceasing to be potentially relevant, but to reactivate it requires a combination of humility to recognize mistakes, courage to restructure, and strategy to reconnect the product with the spirit of its time. Adidas had been the symbol of a type of sport that seemed to belong to another generation, and yet it manages to reinsert itself into the collective imagination of a youth that listens to different sounds, dresses differently, and consumes sport through televisions and early video games. With the house in better order, with iconic products in stores, and with market confidence regained after the stock market debut, the company once again finds itself in a position to explore territories that go beyond pure performance, territories where sport begins to blend more and more evidently with fashion, music, and everyday urban identity. Sport, fashion, and the street. At the end of the 1990s, while Adidas enjoys a steady recovery and manages to establish itself once again in the athletic imagination, something begins to move beneath the surface. A cultural shift that does not emerge from stadiums or federation offices, but from the streets, from neighborhoods, from small concert venues, and from music videos circulating on television channels. Sport continues to be a fundamental axis of the brand, but the way society relates to sportswear begins to transform, and that change opens an unexpected window for Adidas. The possibility of becoming not only a brand that accompanies physical performance, but a daily symbol, a key element in the lifestyle of millions of people who find in the three stripes a language that goes far beyond the result of a game. This phenomenon, which today feels natural, begins silently, almost like a series of coincidences. In different parts of the world, young people from urban cultures start appropriating training garments to create their own style. Loose sweatshirts, tracksuit bottoms, and running shoes designed for performance combine with jeans, chains, caps, and leather jackets, generating a hybrid that breaks the boundaries between sport and fashion. And in that process, Adidas finds itself in a privileged position because many of its classic silhouettes, Superstar, Gazelle, Stan Smith, had already proven to be models capable of surviving the passage of time without losing their freshness, especially when reinterpreted in contexts never originally intended for them. The first clear sign of this transformation had appeared years earlier, when Run DMC, one of the most influential rap groups of its era, decided to go on stage wearing Adidas, superstar without laces, with the tongues pushed forward and a style that turned the shoe into a declaration of identity. What was born as an aesthetic choice within a specific community ended up igniting the spark of a historic collaboration, because Adidas understood that this connection was not a cultural accident, but proof that the brand could resonate powerfully in universes beyond traditional sport. Although Run DMC belongs to an earlier decade, its impact continues to echo through the 1990s and creates an essential precedent. Sportswear can be a symbol of pride, belonging, and personal style without any reference to a stopwatch or a goalpost. As the new century approaches, Adidas decides to turn that intuition into a clear strategy and creates Adidas Originals, a line that recovers the best of the company's historical archive and presents it as urban fashion. The idea has enormous strength because it does not aim to compete with the technical innovation of the high-performance lines, but rather to offer a different narrative, the emotional connection to the pieces that marked generations, the cultural value of the silhouettes that accompanied iconic athletes, and the magnetism of classic design that can be combined with almost any contemporary style. The first Originals catalogs breathe retro air without falling into empty nostalgia. Colors, logos, and cuts that evoke past decades are revived but adapted for an audience living in a completely different environment, faster, more visual, more influenced by global phenomena. In cities, store windows begin to display sneakers that combine clean lines and soft tones, tracksuit pieces with the three stripes stylized on sleeves and legs, and t-shirts with reinterpreted versions of the trefoil, which gradually becomes a symbol as powerful as the stripes themselves. This visual dichotomy, the performance world with the three slanted lines, the urban world with the trefoil, allows Adidas to construct a sort of dual identity that aligns with the cultural demands of the time, without diluting the essence of the brand. In parallel, the company begins collaborating with figures from the worlds of fashion and design, names that contribute a distinct aesthetic without compromising the brand's athletic credibility. One of the most relevant milestones of that era is the partnership with Japanese designer Yohji Yamamoto, who helps create the Y3 line, a proposal that fuses avant-garde minimalism with Adidas's sporting heritage. The collaboration not only opens a new aesthetic territory but also legitimizes the brand within a creative ecosystem where other sports companies have not yet dared to enter. The pieces designed with Yamamoto function as sculptural elements that move between functionality and artistry, demonstrating that a brand with industrial roots can engage with the world of high fashion without losing its identity. Adidas also incorporates the vision of designers such as Stella McCartney, who sees sportswear as a space to address style, functionality, and sustainability. Her presence within the brand attracts a different audience, especially women interested in technical garments that do not abandon an elegant aesthetic. The partnership expands the reach of Adidas, making it relevant in fields where it previously had little presence, from training apparel design to the semi-formal world of runways and fashion editorials. As these collaborations progress and Originals becomes firmly established, something similar unfolds in popular culture. Adidas becomes a recurring symbol in music videos, films, and television series. Jackets with the three stripes appear in street dance scenes. The superstar shoes appear in slow-motion shots of dancers leaping between pavements, and the gazelle takes on a leading role in portrayals of youth immersed in music, skate culture, and independent scenes. Without large planned campaigns designed to manipulate this trend, the brand is integrated organically into the cultural landscape because its simple, recognizable aesthetic aligns with the search for authenticity that characterizes many urban movements. This expansion into fashion does not displace sport, it accompanies it. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of this period is that Adidas discovers how to use its athletic roots to build credibility in the fashion world. While urban trends reinforce the brand's presence in spaces where sport alone would not reach, the boundary between performance and style becomes blurred, and in that blurring lies a fertile territory for growth. A professional athlete can train with the latest footwear technology and then walk through the city wearing an iconic Originals model. A music creator can perform on stage wearing a retro jacket without anyone thinking he is pretending to be an athlete. In business terms, this shift demonstrates the importance of understanding that a product can become a cultural symbol without losing functionality. Adidas learns that when historical roots are deep and design is coherent, objects gain a life of their own beyond their original purpose. Sneakers cease to be simple athletic tools and become vehicles of expression, pieces that tell stories, objects that speak of personality as much as comfort. As the years progress and the new millennium approaches, the brand observes that its influence has multiplied thanks to this dual strategy. Adidas no longer lives only in stadiums or gyms. It lives in neighborhoods, in concerts, in festivals, in schoolyards, and in summer nights when people gather spontaneously and share. Styles that travel from city to city without the need for advertisements. That cultural transversal nature gives the brand an unexpected strength and prepares the ground for more ambitious and complex movements that will come in later years, when the brand connects with new generations of creators who will redefine the very concept of commercial collaboration. Adidas against Nike. By the end of the 1990s, the map of global sport no longer resembles in any way the ground that Adi Dassler walked when he visited locker rooms carrying a suitcase full of prototypes. Now the game is played in packed stadiums. Yes, but also in offices in New York, London, and Tokyo, in meetings with investment funds, in multi-million-dollar television agreements, and in sponsorship contracts that turn certain athletes into walking brands. On that new board, there are two emblems facing each other and competing for every inch of grass, every street, every magazine page. The three stripes of Adidas and the swoosh of Nike. The relationship between them is not a simple commercial rivalry. It resembles a cold war of sport, with maneuvers, counterattacks, and strategic movements that define not only which shoes are sold, but how sports culture is understood in the world. Nike, born in the United States with a mentality very different from the European tradition of Adidas, has managed to take advantage of the media explosion of sport in the era of television and commercial cinema, has attached itself to figures like Michael Jordan, has invented a new way of presenting performance as an individual narrative of overcoming adversity, has spoken directly to the youth with a defiant, almost rebellious tone. Adidas, for its part, comes from a long history linked to national teams, to World Cups, to Olympic Games, to a more institutional image. When the German brand wakes up from its period of crisis and restructures itself in the 1990s, it understands that it is not facing an ordinary rival, but a company that has achieved something very difficult, occupying the center of the cultural conversation around sport in a large part of the planet. Faced with that challenge, the strategy of Adidas is built on two complementary fronts. On the one hand, it deepens what it has always done well: a strong presence in football, in athletics, in sports where tradition matters and federations play a key role. On the other hand, it realizes that it needs to gain volume and strength in markets where it has been losing ground, especially in the North American market, dominated by basketball, baseball, and American football, and in the segment of outdoor activities, where consumers look for high-end, technical equipment for skiing, mountain terrain, and adventure. That idea of gaining weight quickly in specific categories leads, at the end of the 1990s, to one of the most significant decisions of the era: the acquisition of the Salomon Group in 1997. With the purchase of Salomon, Adidas enters forcefully into the world of skiing, trekking, mountain boots, bindings, and all those disciplines lived on snow, rock, and forest. The operation seems logical from a strategic point of view, because it complements the presence of the brand on grass fields and tracks with a territory where technical innovation and product robustness are crucial. In addition, the Salomon Group includes other brands that expand the portfolio and bring Adidas closer to a consumer who may not be paying attention to the final of the Champions League, but who does value a jacket capable of resisting a storm in the Alps. For some years, the conglomerate presents itself as a sort of total sports ecosystem, capable of equipping both the footballer who steps onto the grass of the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium and the skier who descends a black slope in Chamonix. While the company digests that acquisition and integrates it into its structure, football continues to be the great visible battlefield between Adidas and Nike. Every World Cup, every European Championship, every major league becomes an opportunity to associate a brand with the emotion of the goal, with the images repeated in the news broadcasts, with the memory of the fan who keeps a play in mind and, without intending to, also the design of the boots with which it was executed. Adidas maintains historic contracts with federations such as the German, the Argentine, or the Spanish federations, dresses giant clubs, becomes the official supplier of the ball in many competitions, which reinforces its image as an institution of world football. Nike, from the opposite trench, signs emerging national teams, sponsors flashy stars, and presents itself as the option for those who want to break molds. The rivalry becomes visible in every high-level match. In the same play, athletes equipped by one company and the other may cross paths on the field, as if the grass were also a showcase for a corporate duel. Basketball adds another layer to this story of competition. Nike has built an empire around the figure of Michael Jordan, and the Air Jordan line has defined what it means to be a global sports icon and has tied the National Basketball League with cultural and commercial force. Adidas, aware of the importance of that league in the global market, and especially in the United States, moves decisively to seize part of that prominence. In 2001, it becomes the official supplier of National Basketball League uniforms through the later acquisition of Reebok, which will further consolidate that position and begins to outfit all franchises with uniforms that suddenly bear the 3 stripes on the sides of shorts and shirts. That movement has a clear reading. The German company does not want to be limited to national team competitions. It aims to occupy a central place in the most media-dominant league in the world, to enter the homes of millions of viewers every night. The purchase of Reebok, announced in 2005, responds exactly to that logic of accelerating presence in territories where organic growth would have been too slow. Reebok has its own history, especially strong in the United States market, with roots in fitness, in the aerobics boom of the 1980s, and in casual footwear associated with urban culture. Integrating it within the Adidas group means, on paper, adding immediate market share, taking advantage of synergies in production and distribution, and having 2 brands that can divide different consumer sensibilities. One more classic and linked to historical performance, another with different accents, more playful in certain segments. The operation is presented to the world as a chess move that balances forces against Nike and prepares the group to compete for the hegemony of global sport during the following decade. In parallel, Adidas continues to use with skill a tool it has known since the days of Horst Dassler: the construction of long-term alliances with major sports organizations. The company signs agreements with the National Basketball League, with the International Federation of Football, with the European Union of Football Associations, with historic European clubs, and with national teams that are authentic symbolic powers. Every contract translates into presence in press conferences, in signage, in training sessions, in presentations of new uniforms that become small media events. Seeing the Adidas logo on a team's chest or on the sleeve of a jacket provides a sense of legitimacy that carries enormous weight when the spectator later finds the same 3 stripes in a shop in their neighborhood or on a website. This aggressive strategy of expansion and acquisitions, however, comes at a cost. As the group becomes larger, it also becomes more complex to manage. Integrating different corporate cultures, coordinating product lines that sometimes overlap, deciding which brand leads in each market, all of that requires careful decisions and a clarity of vision that is not always easy to maintain when facing a rival as skilled as Nike. At certain moments, Adidas manages to position itself as leader in specific categories. At others, it seems always a step behind in trends or campaigns, and must react to external moves with defensive strategies. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the era of acquisitions and corporate warfare between Adidas and Nike illustrates very well a tension that appears in many businesses that grow to reach global scale. The need to combine inorganic growth, meaning buying companies and adding market share with a check, with the internal capacity to innovate, to create products that by themselves enchant the consumer. The purchases of Salomon and Reebok as well as the major agreements with leagues and federations, are movements that appear in headlines, impress analysts, and generate the feeling that everything is under control. But long-term success continues to depend on something much harder to maintain: that every shoe, every shirt, every ball has a clear reason to exist for the person who buys it. While the three stripes and the swoosh divide stadiums and pavements between them, the world begins to change in another direction that does not yet dominate the conversation of these great corporate battles. Mobile phones are transformed into small computers. The first training applications appear timidly. Brands begin to experiment with sensors, data, and personalized measurements. And at the same time, the concern for the environmental impact of the textile and footwear industry gains space in the news and in the consciousness of consumers. Without fully realizing it, Adidas is entering a time in which the playing field will no longer be only physical, but will expand also to screens, networks, algorithms, and public commitments about how things are produced. Technology, apps, and sustainability. Upon entering the 2000s, sport begins to surround itself with screens, graphics, and data like never before. Gyms fill with televisions showing specialized channels. Park runners start wearing on their wrists watches that count steps and calories. Mobile telephones stop being simple devices for calling and become small platforms where an entire life fits, training included. In the middle of that silent transformation, the great sports brands realize that it is no longer enough to design a shoe that grips well or a shirt that breathes. Now the conversation revolves around the information that can be extracted from each movement, around the capacity to measure, compare, and share performance with an ease that would have seemed science fiction a few decades earlier. Adidas observes this change with a mixture of curiosity and urgency. It had come from winning battles in stadiums, on tracks, and on streets, but the digital terrain was still a space to be conquered, a place where software companies, electronics giants, and new emerging applications moved with speed. If in the years of Adi the key gesture was kneeling in the locker room to adjust the studs of a boot, now the scene began to move to the screen of a telephone, where the user reviewed graphics of heart rate, route maps, and statistics compared with friends from all over the world. Whoever managed to accompany the athlete in that invisible dimension would gain something very valuable: daily presence in his pocket, on his wrist, in his mental routine. In that context, MiCoach is born, the bet of Adidas to create a digital ecosystem that connects footwear, clothing, and electronic devices. The idea is clear: to offer the user something more than a physical product, to propose a virtual coach that records his runs, measures his speeds, analyzes his progression, and gives him recommendations. Templates with integrated sensors are developed, devices to hold the telephone, heart rate monitors, and applications are launched that promise to guide the runner, the brooded amateur football player, the occasional tennis player. The approach mixes hardware and software and seeks to transfer the experience that Adidas has accumulated for decades with elite athletes into a format accessible to anyone who puts on a pair of shoes and goes out to the street. The advertisements of the time show people of different profiles, not only professionals, training with MiCoach, seeing how progress bars rise and fall, listening to instructions in their earphones, later reviewing at home the results of their session. The company strives to make the technology not seem like a cold layer placed over sport, but rather a natural extension of the obsession for performance that has always characterized it. However, the reality of the digital ecosystem is complicated. The fragmentation of platforms, the speed with which new applications appear, the entry of technological giants into the world of connected fitness make the project, even if ambitious, not reach the domination that some imagined at the beginning. Far from giving up, Adidas decides to deepen the digital dimension with broader strategic moves. One of the most significant steps comes when it acquires Runtastic, an Austrian sports tracking application that already had millions of active users. Instead of trying to build from scratch a community around its own tools, the brand buys a platform that is already installed on the telephones of runners, cyclists, and movement enthusiasts, and that offers maps, challenges, statistics, and a very rooted social structure. Through this purchase, Adidas strengthens its presence in the daily life of people who go out to train, even in those cases where they still do not wear on their feet shoes with its 3 stripes. Technology does not remain only in the world of applications. In parallel, the company continues researching new ways to manufacture footwear and clothing with more precise and efficient processes. Experimental projects such as Futurecraft appear, where 3-dimensional printed soles, advanced materials, and more flexible production methods are explored. A highly automated factory is opened in Germany, known as Speed Factory, with the objective of bringing part of the production closer to key markets and reducing times between design, manufacturing, and distribution, using robots and advanced manufacturing techniques. The message that is intended to be transmitted is clear. Adidas is not a brand that has remained anchored in black and white photos of the past. It sees itself as a laboratory that plays on the border between engineering, design, and sport. While the technological front advances, another subject begins to occupy increasingly more space in global conversations: sustainability. News about pollution, climate change, plastics in the oceans, and labor exploitation in textile industries force large companies to review their model, and Adidas is directly questioned. It manufactures millions of pairs of shoes each year, uses synthetic materials derived from petroleum, depends for decades on complex supply chains, with factories spread across Asia and other regions. Ignoring that conversation would mean running the risk of falling behind a generation that begins to ask where exactly each product it buys comes from. The response of Adidas is articulated on multiple levels. On one hand, it announces public commitments related to the use of recycled materials, the reduction of carbon emissions in its operations, and the progressive elimination of certain problematic components. On the other hand, it establishes collaborations with organizations focused on environmental protection, such as Parley for the Oceans, with whom it develops emblematic projects: shoes and garments made from plastics recovered from the sea, converted into thread and used, instead of virgin materials. Each launch of this type is communicated as tangible proof that it is possible to combine attractive design, sports performance, and ecological responsibility. The campaign of products made with recycled plastic works on 2 planes at the same time. On the practical plane, it truly introduces different materials into the production chain, which implies adjusting machines, suppliers, and processes. On the symbolic plane, it educates the consumer, showing him that a product can be desirable precisely because it tries to mitigate an environmental harm, and not only because it has a striking color or a new cushioning technology. There are debates about the real impact of these efforts, and about how much they respond to deep convictions or to marketing dynamics. But the fact that a brand of the scale of Adidas dedicates serious resources to this type of initiative helps to make the subject central in the entire industry. In addition to materials, the company reviews its labor models and its transparency. It begins to publish more information about its suppliers, submits to external evaluations, participates in initiatives that seek to improve conditions in the factories that produce its articles. The path is far from perfect. The pressure from social and environmental organizations remains constant, but the issue can no longer be pushed under the rug. It becomes part of the value proposition of the brand, of the narrative it builds when it claims to represent a future in which sport is practiced on a planet still habitable. The combination of digital technology and sustainability generates a new type of narrative around Adidas. It is no longer limited to saying, "With us you will run faster," or "With us you will look better." On the street, it begins to suggest that training with its products connects you with a global community of shared data, of collective challenges, and that at the same time it represents a minimal gesture of responsibility toward the environment. The 21st century athlete that appears in its campaigns is no longer only a muscular athlete pursuing a record. He can also be someone who runs to release stress, who cares about his mental health, who chooses a model of shoes because it is made with recycled materials, and synchronizes with an application that allows him to see his daily progress. For any entrepreneur observing this stage, there is a powerful lesson. The great brands that wish to survive in changing contexts must be capable of moving on several layers at once. Adidas must continue manufacturing physically excellent products, but at the same time it must learn to program, to manage data, to sign agreements with environmental organizations, to dialogue with users who are no longer simple buyers but active participants in a shared story. Value is no longer generated only on the assembly line. It is also generated in the cloud, in impact reports, in social networks where reputation can grow or sink in a matter of days. While all this occurs, the culture around shoes enters a phase of extreme boiling. The term sneakerhead becomes popular. Limited releases become events. Resales reach unusual prices, and sports footwear begins to occupy a central space in global fashion. Adidas, which had already learned to play with its archives through originals, and which is experimenting in digital and sustainable terrains, sees a new opportunity in that fever for the shoe as an object of desire, an opportunity that it will explore in a radical manner by partnering with creative figures capable of converting each release into a cultural phenomenon that completely transcends the classic idea of sports footwear. The Yeezy era and the cultural boom. At the beginning of the decade of 2010, Adidas had already learned to move between stadiums, discrete runways, training applications, and speeches about sustainability, but there was a territory where it continued to feel the constant pressure of the swoosh of Nike, the exact center of the cultural conversation, that point where sport, fashion, music, and social networks merge to such an extent that it becomes difficult to distinguish where one thing begins and where another ends. The youngest audience, the one that sets trends without asking for permission, had turned sneakers into a canvas for expressing personality, status, and belonging to a specific community, and the game of exclusivity had become so intense that each limited release seemed like a combination of sports event, concert, and auction, all at the same time. In that context, a figure appears strongly, someone who until then had maintained an intense relationship with Nike: Kanye West. Rapper, producer, designer, frustrated for many years, expert in generating controversy every time he opened his mouth, West dreamed of becoming a real reference in footwear and clothing design, not only someone who put his name on a one-off collaboration. After a period of tensions with Nike due to the lack of creative control and contractual issues, the perfect opportunity arises for Adidas, which sees in him something more than a famous musician. It sees an obsessive creator willing to get involved in the design process with the same intensity with which others lock themselves in the recording studio. The agreement between Adidas and Kanye West marks a turning point in the recent history of the brand. From that alliance, Yeezy is born, a line presented in an almost cinematic way, with shows in New York, earthy color palettes, designs that seem to come from an apocalyptic near future, and an aesthetic that breaks with the classic logic of sports footwear. The silhouettes, beginning with the Yeezy Boost 750 and leading to the definitive explosion with the Yeezy Boost 350, move away from usual shapes, introduce sock-like fabrics, voluminous soles with Boost technology, and a sense of aggressive minimalism that immediately becomes the new reference of the sneaker culture. Unlike other collaborations where the celebrity lends his image to an already existing model, in Yeezy, the narrative is built around the figure of West as a designer, as someone who gives opinions about materials, shapes, proportions, and the staging. Adidas, for its part, provides engineering, production capacity, global distribution, and the experience accumulated over decades in the manufacture of high-performance footwear. The result is a strange and tremendously effective hybrid, products with a strong aesthetic load, backed by real technology, and located in a territory where the border between sneaker for dressing and collectible piece becomes completely blurred. The business model around Yeezy relies on a tool that had already been perfected in the sneaker world at that time: controlled scarcity. Releases are announced in advance, units are limited, raffles and waiting lists are established, and on the release day physical lines form in front of some stores while, in parallel, websites collapse. Whoever obtains a pair feels that they have gained something more than a utilitarian object. They experience the euphoria of having passed a kind of entrance test to a club. Resale skyrockets, prices multiply. Yeezys appear on auction platforms and on social networks, where they are displayed as trophies. Adidas had spent decades making footwear so that people could run or play better. Suddenly, it finds itself with a product that generates profits even before touching the street. In the pure economy of test, scarcity, and desire. The impact goes far beyond sales figures, which are considerable in themselves. Yeezy brings Adidas back to the center of the cultural radar of a generation that consumes fashion through Instagram, music videos, memes, and street photos. The voluminous silhouettes of some models and the clean lines of others begin to be copied, reinterpreted, and parodied on social networks, to the point that they influence the entire footwear industry, including the competition. Suddenly, many brands begin to release models with thicker soles, more muted colors, elastic fabrics, and a style associated with that sensation of worn futurism that Yeezy put on the table from the beginning. For Adidas, the collaboration becomes a financial and symbolic goldmine. Financial reports reflect the growing weight of the line. Analysts speak of Yeezy as one of the engines of growth in high-end segments, and the brand achieves something very important: a narrative in which it is perceived as the home of creative avant-garde, not only as a historical house respected for its past. At the same time, executives carefully observe something that any entrepreneur relying on individual figures should keep in mind: the increasing dependence on the charisma, behavior, and decisions of a single person. Kanye West is a talented creator, but also an unpredictable figure, with a complex relationship with the media, prone to explosive declarations and personal moves difficult to fit into corporate manuals. For a time, that unpredictability seems to be part of the appeal, providing a sensation of controlled danger that fits well with the idea of wearing something different on one's feet, something that seems to challenge what is established. But, in parallel, some executives begin to wonder what would happen if that rope broke, if the central figure of the collaboration crossed limits that the company could not support without damaging its own reputation. While that underground tension accumulates, Yeezy continues its expansion. New models, more colors, releases for different audiences, from children's collections to more accessible versions that allow the universe of the line to reach more people without entirely losing the aura of exclusivity. Each drop becomes a topic of conversation. Each photo of West with an unreleased prototype sparks speculation. Each new design is analyzed in internet forums as if it were another chapter of a series that no one wants to stop following. The Yeezy phenomenon is not just a collaboration between brand and artist. It is an ongoing narrative that mixes design, rumor, leaks, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. From the perspective of Adidas, the Yeezy era demonstrates the ability of a company almost 100 years old to reinvent itself by relying on contemporary cultural codes without entirely losing its roots. Sneakers with boost soles and disruptive design are made by the same brand that outfitted Jesse Owens and the German national team of the Miracle of Berne, a historical continuity that adds depth to the story. However, at the same time, this era exposes the company to a new type of risk, a reputational risk linked to the volatility of the figure that supports a large part of the project. Behind the scenes, the internal teams of Adidas take note of that fragile dimension. They know that such a profitable agreement, almost addictive in terms of visibility and benefits, can become a burden if the relationship deteriorates or if the actions of the creative partner cross ethical or social boundaries that the public is no longer willing to tolerate. The history of entrepreneurship is full of examples in which an apparently perfect alliance ends in traumatic rupture, and in this case the signs, although still diffuse during the years of greatest success, are already written in the intense and contradictory personality of Kanye West. While the lines in front of stores continue to grow and resale, prices skyrocket, the company finds itself, without fully acknowledging it, walking on a tightrope. It enjoys the strength of a phenomenon that would have been unthinkable in the era of Adi, while exposing itself to the consequences of having tied an important part of its contemporary identity to a single name. That latent tension will eventually explode when the words and decisions of West cross limits that force Adidas to rethink the relationship from the roots, opening a much darker stage marked by immense inventories, internal debates, and an uncomfortable question about how much a global brand should depend on the figure of a single creator. Rupture, toxic inventory, and new direction. For several years, while the Yeezy models sold out in a matter of minutes and appeared on magazine covers, red carpets, and paparazzi photographs, inside the offices of Adidas, there was a peculiar mixture of satisfaction, and nervousness, because the numbers were spectacular. The project was sustained by growing profit, and the brand occupied a privileged place in global culture, but at the same time, everyone knew that an important part of that success rested on the unpredictable character of a single person, someone who, through talent and controversy, had shown that he did not fully understand the meaning of the word limit. That tension accumulated until, in the year 2022, it stopped being an internal topic of conversation and turned into a public fire impossible to contain. The openly anti-Semitic statements made by Kanye West, expressed in interviews, social networks, and public appearances, crossed a line that could no longer be interpreted as simple artistic eccentricity or calculated provocation. They were messages completely incompatible with any ethical code that was even minimally serious, especially for a company with German roots, with a history marked by the period of Nazism, and with a historical responsibility that it has never been able, nor wished, to ignore. Within days, the pressure from public opinion, from affected communities, from the media, and from Adidas's own employees became unsustainable. The company found itself facing a brutal dilemma: maintain an extraordinarily profitable contract with a figure who was generating deep reputational damage, or break the relationship abruptly and assume financial consequences of unprecedented magnitude. The decision arrived in the exhausted form of a forceful statement. Adidas announced the immediate end of its collaboration with Kanye West and of the Yeezy line. With that sentence, the company cut at the root one of its most successful but also most risky alliances, and sent a clear message to the market, to its own teams, and to the Poxy world in general. There are lines that cannot be crossed without paying a price, even when what is at stake is many billions of euros. For many observers, the rupture was inevitable, almost late, for the executives responsible for balancing the accounts. However, it opened a very concrete nightmare that went beyond future sales, the inventory that had already been manufactured. In warehouses distributed across different regions of the world, Adidas accumulated millions of pairs of Yeezy shoes that had not yet reached the market, valued in figures that later reports would place around $1,200 million or more, depending on the moment of estimation. That stock, which until a few weeks earlier represented a promise of extraordinary revenue for the following fiscal periods, suddenly became what many began to call toxic inventory, merchandise associated with a personal brand that the company could no longer wish to be directly linked to. Destroying it would represent a tremendous financial blow and an environmental waste difficult to justify. Selling it as if nothing had happened would have been perceived by a large part of the public as a way of continuing to profit from a figure who had just been cut off for racism and hatred. In the months following the rupture, internal debates about what to do with that inventory were intense. A solution was needed that, without disguising the problem, reduced losses, avoided an even greater ecological impact, and sent a responsible message. Finally, the company opted for an intermediate approach, to liquidate part of the Yeezy stock in controlled releases, making clear that a significant portion of the profits would be directed to organizations and causes connected to the fight against hatred, discrimination, and anti-Semitism. The idea was to transform, as far as possible, a poisoned situation into a mechanism of partial repair, although, evidently, no financial decision could erase what had happened nor completely extinguish the controversy. For the public, this stage was confusing. Some consumers still desired the Yeezy models for their design and for the aura of exclusivity built over the years, while others rejected outright the idea of wearing a product tied, even indirectly, to someone who had spread such harmful messages. Resale remained very active. Discussions on social networks flared up each time a new batch of stock was announced, and the brand had to walk on extremely thin ice, explaining its decisions, acknowledging the moral and financial cost of the situation, and preparing for a future in which it would need to rebuild part of its recent identity without the support of that star collaboration. Meanwhile, internal figures showed with brutal clarity the impact of the disaster. The loss of revenue anticipated by the cancellation of the agreement was so large that Adidas's financial reports spoke openly of profit declines, warnings to shareholders, and downward revisions of objectives. For a company accustomed to presenting a narrative of constant growth, publicly admitting that a single decision, however necessary it was, dragged hundreds of millions in losses, was a test of transparency, but also a wake-up call about the level of dependence they had reached on Yeezy. From a business perspective, it was like discovering that one of the pillars holding the building was not made of concrete, but of a very fragile mixture of creativity and someone else's reputation. In parallel with the management of the place, inventory, and the immediate consequences of the rupture, another key movement was taking place in the history of Adidas: a change in the leadership. The appointment of a new chief executive officer with experience in the sector and, specifically, with a past link to Puma, its historical rival, symbolized the intention to review strategy, to take distance from some decisions of the recent past, and to put the house in order with an expansive vision. That new leadership faced a complex task: to rebuild investor confidence, calm employee anxiety, maintain competitiveness against Nike and other emerging brands, and, in addition, define what the Adidas after Yeezy should look like. In the following months, we began to see signs of that new direction. Product lines connected to the classic sporting roots of the brand were reinforced, with special emphasis on football, running, training. Sponsorship agreements were reviewed and work intensified with athletes and teams capable of providing stability to the corporate image. Figures of basketball, track and field, women's football, national teams that represented values of inclusion, effort, and diversity. The idea was to shift the focus from the nearly hypnotic shine of a single collaboration toward a more plural landscape, where the brand would not depend so heavily on a single face, but on a constellation of ambassadors and stories. At the same time, Adidas kept alive its commitment to sustainability, innovation, reminding consumers and markets that its vision of the future was not limited to the scandals of the present. Projects using recycled materials, product lines with reduced environmental impact, initiatives for transparency in the supply chain, and investments in new manufacturing technologies continued steadily, with an approach perhaps less media-driven, but more aligned with the need to build a credible long-term narrative. The brand seemed to say, "We have made mistakes. We have placed too many chips on a single play, but our purpose continues to be to accompany sport and the daily life of millions of people in a responsible way." In narrative terms, the stage of rupture with Kanye and the management of the toxic inventory functions almost as a mirror of the darkest moments in the past of Adidas. In the same way that the company had to critically review its role during the Nazi regime and during the years of war, now it was forced to ask itself to what extent it was willing to sacrifice principles for commercial success. The difference is that this time, the scrutiny was instantaneous and global, amplified by social networks, digital media, and a public opinion more aware of the importance of coherence between discourse and action. For anyone observing the business history of Adidas from the perspective of entrepreneurship, this phase offers a lesson that is as uncomfortable as it is valuable. Associating with powerful figures can catapult a brand to levels of visibility and sales difficult to achieve by other means. But each alliance of that kind is also a bet on the character, decisions, and contingencies of a person who, by definition, escapes the company's full control. Managing that kind of risk does not consist solely of writing solid contracts. It implies being clear about which lines will not be crossed, even if the price to pay seems enormous. While the company reorganizes its present and strives to look forward, the world of sport, fashion, and culture does not stop. New generations of consumers, who have grown up with screens, networks, and immediate access to information, approach brands with a mixture of admiration and distrust, demanding not only good design and performance, but also ethical coherence and transparency. And it is precisely at that point where the next chapter of this story is played out, in Adidas's capacity to use everything it has learned, from the family oven in Herzogenaurach to the most recent crises, and transform it into a vision of the future that does not depend on a single star, but on a solid identity capable of withstanding any storm. The future of Adidas. After the storm brought by the separation from Yeezy and the immense challenge of managing an inventory filled with ethical and financial tensions, Adidas finds itself in a moment in which every decision seems to carry a particular weight, as if the brand were entering a stage where it is no longer enough to simply survive or correct mistakes. Now it is obliged to clearly define who it wants to be during the next decades. The competitive landscape continues to be fierce. Culture evolves at a speed that challenges any traditional structure, and consumer expectations have multiplied to encompass matters ranging from design and comfort to sustainability, transparency, and social coherence. In this context, the company begins to build a vision that combines its sporting heritage with a determined openness toward a future where innovation is not an accessory, but a vital necessity. The first axis of this new stage is the full recovery of the original sporting meaning, understood not as a nostalgic return to the past, but as the reaffirmation of sport as a bridge between generations, cultures, and historical moments. Adidas has been, since the times of Adi Dassler, a brand that believes in the transformative value of physical performance, and the new direction emphasizes that essence. In its recent campaigns, the spotlight falls on athletes who represent diversity of styles, bodies, and trajectories, from runners who train at dawn to escape the noise of the city to national teams that carry the responsibility of being a collective symbol for millions of people. This way of narrating sport connects with a world in which physical activity is no longer limited to professional competition, but includes mental well-being, personal improvement, and the search for identity. In this context, the brand strives to regain ground in fundamental categories such as running, a territory where competition is intense and where technological innovation has become a permanent requirement. Models equipped with new high-response foams, structures that optimize the energy efficiency of each stride, and aerodynamic designs created to accompany both elite runners and people taking part in their first 5-kilometer race form part of this strategy. The idea is to show that Adidas remains a relevant actor in the world of real performance, beyond creative collaborations or temporary cultural phenomena. In parallel, football continues to be a backbone of the brand, perhaps the deepest of all. The national teams, the world championships, the official balls, and the clubs with which it collaborates are essential pieces to keep alive a legacy that crosses generations. In recent years, the work with major sports institutions has been reinforced, taking care not only of the design of the kits, but also of the story that is activated behind each shirt, each protagonist, each tournament. In a world where football has become a massive global industry, Adidas attempts to convey the message that it understands both its commercial dimension and its emotional value. That value that makes a shirt become a family symbol for decades. The second major pillar of the new stage is innovation as a daily practice, not as a dramatic gesture. The company drives projects in which technology ceases to be an add-on and becomes a tool to rethink entirely the relationship between the athlete and their equipment. Three-dimensional printing processes evolve toward more personalized soles, capable of adapting to different stride styles. Smart fabrics advance toward designs that regulate temperature and distribute moisture with greater precision. And digital platforms are refined to offer more immersive and useful training experiences. In this phase, innovation does not seek visual prominence, but deep usefulness, something that can be felt in every movement, in every kilometer, in every session. Added to this push is an area that has become strategic in the industry: artificial intelligence applied to design and performance analysis. Adidas begins to incorporate tools that allow it to anticipate trends, optimize processes, design patterns in a matter of hours, and analyze athlete data to improve products with millimeter-level precision. These technologies do not replace human intuition or aesthetic sensitivity, but they do open a new spectrum in which creativity and data coexist to produce models that fit better with the real habits and needs of users. In a world saturated with information, the ability to transform raw data into useful decisions becomes a differentiating factor. The third axis, inseparable from the previous ones, is the commitment to sustainability and social responsibility. The company knows that it can no longer conceive its future without confronting head-on the environmental challenges that affect the entire planet. For this reason, it reinforces its product lines created with recycled materials, expands collaborations with organizations dedicated to the protection of marine ecosystems, invests in manufacturing processes that seek to reduce emissions and experiments with circular economy systems, including shoe models designed to be easily disassembled and recycled at the end of their useful life. The objective is to turn sustainability into a design standard, a transversal principle, not a sporadic gesture intended to generate media applause. Beyond environmental impact, Adidas also pays attention to human impact. Transparency in the supply chain, care for working conditions in external factories, and responsibility in hiring practices become central elements in building long-term trust in a market where social networks amplify any inconsistency. In this field, the brand attempts to convey the message that it understands that prestige is not protected solely with striking campaigns or famous athletes, but also with the quiet but necessary daily ethics. The fourth axis is the relationship with culture, which continues to be a fertile but also delicate field. After a stage marked by an excessive dependence on a specific figure and the consequences that this brought, Adidas strives to diversify its link with the creative world. It collaborates with emerging designers, with artists from different disciplines, and with community projects that approach sport from different perspectives. Instead of betting on a single dominant voice, it opens itself to an ecosystem with multiple influences, where stories arise from groups, neighborhoods, cities, and movements, and not only from individual characters with planetary reach. This strategy not only reduces risks, but enriches the global narrative of the brand. Within this new cultural approach, urban fashion continues to occupy a privileged space, because everyday life continues to merge with sport in surprising ways. Retro silhouettes experience a revival, as if the Adidas archive were an inexhaustible source of inspiration. At the same time, new models that blend futuristic lines with classic touches appear as responses to the changing tastes of new generations. The brand has understood that urban aesthetics are profoundly cyclical, and that many times the key is not to invent something radically new, but to reinterpret intelligently what has already worked, adapting it to current rhythms and sensitivities. Finally, the company focuses on something that may be the most complex to build: a clear, coherent, and adaptable identity. After decades in which the brand has experienced moments of glory, deep crises, cultural relevance, fierce competition, strategic mistakes, and unexpected rebirths, a crucial question arises about what it means to be Adidas today. The answer cannot be written in a slogan or in a seasonal campaign. It must be expressed in sustained decisions, in products that speak without needing explanations, and in a way of being present in people's lives that combines history, innovation, and responsibility. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this stage offers a powerful conclusion. Large companies, even those that seem indestructible, need to review their purpose on a regular basis, because the market changes, society changes, and generations change. Adidas has spent almost a century navigating between eras, industries, cultures, and controversies, and it has managed to stay alive thanks to its ability to listen, adapt processes, absorb lessons, and take brave steps when necessary. What comes next will depend on its ability to continue balancing tradition and modernity, risk and prudence, creativity and rigor. At this point in the story, the brand looks forward like someone preparing for a long-distance race, aware of the terrain it has just crossed, attentive to the signals of the environment, and supported by the certainty that sport, in all its forms, continues to be a universal language capable of uniting millions of people. And with that certainty, Adidas moves toward a future in which every step, whether a sprint, a calm walk, or a play in a full stadium, will be an opportunity to demonstrate that the three stripes still have much to say. Thank you for accompanying me on this deep journey through the history of Adidas. It has been a pleasure to share it with you. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to see more stories told with this level of detail, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. And before you go, tell me in the comments from where you are watching us and which part of this story surprised you the most. Your participation helps tremendously in allowing this project to continue growing. Good night.